นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ You may have noticed when you came into the monastery over the hill they're having something called a planned burn or a controlled burn. It's the Forestry Department and Department of Sustainability, I think. They're doing a burn-off in the forest to reduce the fuel, to protect the houses and the monastery and other properties in the neighborhood. And sometimes we joke about it. It's like, if the conditions are right, the air is still, and everything is good, then the planned burn, the controlled burn will go well, and it's safe, and they have fire department officers and so on site to make sure things are looked after. But occasionally the conditions change, the wind picks up, things change, or they encounter a problem, more fuel than they thought, and the controlled burn becomes an uncontrolled burn, which of course is dangerous. Doesn't happen very often, but it does happen once in a while. But it's a bit like human beings. Normally human beings, we control ourselves. We have an even temper, we say, and we have basic mindfulness and awareness, and we're under control and we know what we're doing. But then sometimes conditions change. The winds change, the worldly winds change, and things become out of control, and our mood changes and our thoughts change, and the physical and mental sensations change, and we get a flare-up maybe, especially when things don't go our way, unexpected bad news or painful experiences, difficulties we encounter. With the changing conditions, then you can get an uncontrolled flare-up in the mind. And often it's fast, and we don't see it coming, but suddenly we're suffering. And then we have to work out what to do next and control the damage, just as the fire officials have to control the damage when the winds come and the burn gets out of control. And that's one of the reasons we practice Dhamma. We're developing the skills for both prevention of the flare-ups, the suffering, and also to have some skills ready for if we do fall into a suffering and have to manage it and get ourselves back to normal, return to that evenness of mind and sense of normality in our mind after the suffering. And we try to do that as quickly as possible, as well as possible. And in essence, this is what we're doing, what Buddhist practice and what the Buddha taught is all about. It's learning how to deal with suffering well and end it as an experience. And this is particularly focused on suffering in our own mind, our own hearts. Of course, we also put effort into reducing the suffering in the world out there, but that's a little bit more challenging and more distant from us. Often where we get quick success is in reducing the experience of suffering in our own hearts and minds. There's a sutta, Upanishad Sutta, it's quite often quoted as an important teaching the Buddha gave based on, they translate it as transcendental dependent arising. The Buddha pointed out suffering has its cause, but then happiness also has its cause, or the end of suffering has its cause. And the basic principle of Buddhist practice and teaching is that everything has its cause, and because of that, then things can be remedied. The remedy for suffering is the Buddhist path, the Eightfold Noble Path. That's something to be developed, and that becomes the cause for the end of suffering. So nothing is hopeless, nothing is controlled by some superior being, or nothing is fixed, determined, always has to be like this, no other way. The insight the Buddha had was that things go according to causes and conditions. So just as suffering arises through its own causes, it can also end when those causes change and we develop a whole new set of causes and conditions, and suffering can disappear from our experience. And this sutta was pointing that out. The Buddha explained the normal, in that sutta, the Buddha explained the normal sort of passage or pathway, how suffering arises for human beings, the process of dependent arising. So beginning with ignorance or unawareness, lack of insight into the Four Noble Truths, and just basic delusion, unawareness, gives rise to karmic formations, and on, giving rise to body and mind and sense contact, which gives rise to feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and then based on that arises craving, wanting and not wanting, liking and disliking, which fuels clinging, which fuels existence and all the karmic activities we do based on our existence, and leads to suffering. But then he talked about how suffering can be the cause for faith to arise. Because when we're suffering, we can start looking around for a way out of suffering. And that's probably why most people come to practice meditation and develop strong faith in the Buddhist teachings. It's because they're looking for a way out of suffering. So in that sense, suffering can be quite a useful thing for us, quite a good thing. We don't usually think of it that way. This word for suffering in Buddhism is dukkha. Most people don't look on dukkha as anything good. They look on it as something to be avoided at all costs. Any painful experience, unpleasant experience, stressful experience is to be avoided, or if it happens, to be got rid of as quickly as possible. But actually, dukkha has its good side because it can stimulate the search for the way out of dukkha, the way out of suffering. So we can even say sometimes, thank you, dukkha, thank you, suffering, because you're prompting me or reminding me to look for a way out of suffering. And that way out of suffering is where faith arises. So particularly when we hear the teachings, it gives that spark. Hearing the teachings illuminates the mind with that sense, there's a way out of this. There's something I can do about this. There's a way to practice. And the mind brightens with faith. And out of this brightening, illuminating experience, then you get some even some joy. So suffering can lead on to joy, but it's the joy that comes when you see a way out, when you hear the teachings and see, oh, there's a way I can practice and develop myself, and there's various qualities I can cultivate which will help me out of my suffering. That's where joy comes from. And joy leads to rapture and tranquility and the arising of samadhi as we practice mindfulness, develop states of samadhi, stillness, and this supports insight, clearly seeing and knowing the way things are, and this gives rise to dispassion, disenchantment, dispassion, ultimately liberation from suffering and the causes of suffering. So suffering can initiate a whole process of the arising all kinds of good qualities and the effort in the practice that ultimately leads to liberation and freedom from suffering. So in that sense, suffering is not all bad. It has its role to play. But of course, we don't want to dwell on suffering and get stuck in it, which is so often what we do. Or sometimes we even compound it and make it worse. That's often when we react in the wrong way to suffering and we just want to get rid of it. We attach to it, cling to it, and take it personally. And this sense of self arises with, I am suffering and I don't like it, I don't want it. But instead of going to the path and cultivating the path, we just follow more craving and just want to get rid of our suffering. And that's a very common human experience, something you can reflect on in your own life. When you have experiences of stress, suffering, pain, what do? How often do you just try to get rid of it, block it out, distract yourself from it, suppress it, deny it? Part of the joke about the planned burn is, if it does go wrong, then they don't like to admit it because it's a mistake. Fair enough, people make mistakes, but we don't like to admit mistakes, and they say, oh, no, nothing's wrong, even though sometimes you can tell something's gone wrong. Suffering is the same, isn't it? We don't like to admit we're suffering. We don't like to tell other people we're suffering. Quite often we have pride, conceit. Our sense of self often doesn't like to admit suffering because it's seen as like a fault or a weakness. So that's another problem in itself. We don't even admit it. So we hide it and deny it. And that's especially common these days in the world because more and more our culture is one based on very superficial images that we try and project with other people. Online or even to other people's face. We don't like to admit faults, mistakes, weaknesses. We don't like to do that because then that may become everyone else's view of us. We're the one who made the mistake. So we don't like to own up to it. We don't like to take responsibility for things because sometimes it can have consequences, to do with our job, our career, our social life, who we are, who we think we are. Nothing good. So we don't like to admit mistakes, suffering, problems. Sometimes it's because we have to maybe look after other people, so we put a brave face on it and try to quickly suppress any kind of suffering in our life because we've got to help others or look after others as well. But the Buddha encouraged us to put a brave face on it and to be honest, and not necessarily that we have to tell the whole world that we're suffering, but more just to recognize suffering as suffering. First noble truth, dukkha, is dukkha. Because that's the beginning of where you start to seek for a genuine way out of it, beyond it. Seek to follow the path that the Buddha gave us. When we're still not doing that, we're not ready to admit suffering or recognize suffering, and we do suppress it, well, it tends to come out often in these uncontrolled ways. It spills out in our behavior. And that's why the Buddha encouraged us to put effort into developing virtuous or harmless behavior in our daily life. It's the first area of practice. Maybe taking on the 5 precepts as guidelines for our behavior, because when suffering arises and we're not very mindful of it, not very aware, where it tends to spill out. So, say when you get angry, it will come out in your speech, your actions. Or when we have strong greed, it will come out in your behavior. Maybe we act in more selfish or self-centered ways when suffering comes out. So that's often the first area of practice, is just to learn to be more mindful about our speech and our actions, so that we're not taking our suffering out on the rest of the world or letting it out to affect our relations with the rest of the world. And so we practice 5 precepts, training in the 5 precepts. They're basically training rules for our speech, our actions, to limit the damage from suffering as it arises in our hearts. If you're very angry or afraid or very attached, possessive, obsessive, greed, at least you're learning to restrain the worst aspects of that by training with precepts and basic morality, basic virtue. The Buddha pointed out, when human beings are not very mindful of their speech or actions, they tend to fall under the sway of 2 main forces, either lust, lustful desire, and all its formations, or anger and aversion. Whereas somebody who's practicing the Buddhist path, who's had faith arise, and they listen to the teachings and they're trying to train themselves, they are developing the qualities of one who's in practice. One way the Buddha referred to somebody who's in practice or in training is a sappurisa, somebody who's a well-practiced person, a wise person, a good person, a knowledgeable person, somebody who's heard the teachings, faith has arisen. They have certain qualities. They know how to be patient, and they have faith, and they respond to situations with compassion, with mindfulness, with wisdom. This is somebody who's in training. The untrained person, somebody who hasn't heard the teachings or doesn't value them, they tend to be more coarse. So they act in more coarse, more violent or aggressive ways, more greedy, selfish ways, following their lust, following their anger. And so they get different outcomes. They're creating more suffering for themselves and others. Whereas the one who has heard the teachings and is practicing, well, they're intent on reducing their suffering and reducing the suffering of others. So the Buddha encouraged us to look into our speech and our actions as the sort of first line of protection in our practice and the first area to practice. Because with all the study in the world, we may have practiced meditation before, may have listened to the Dhamma, we may have lots of knowledge of what the Buddha taught. If we're not very aware of our speech and actions, then we're still you might say a beginner, and we still can easily be creating the causes for suffering for ourselves and others. We're still prone to the suffering spilling out in our behavior, and we can take out our suffering on others quite unconsciously sometimes, without realizing even. It's fast, isn't it? How often do we realize how fast greed and anger come up in our mind and seem to be like uncontrollable forces that suddenly they just take us over? A lot of it is just habit. We haven't been listening to the Dhamma, reflecting on the Dhamma much, haven't been practicing much mindfulness. So just out of habit, we quite easily get caught into greed and selfishness and anger in our behavior. It's like the parrots in the forest here. Like sometimes we feed the parrots seeds. I remember when I started feeding parrots, the first day you put out seeds, and it takes them all day to eat those seeds. They know where they are, but they're very kind of shy and careful, and they just eat a little bit and then they fly away and then they come back a bit later. But out of habit, over the days, the weeks, they get more and more used to it. Maybe they even expect it, the food to be there, so they're quicker. So then you put out seeds, and 5 minutes later they're all gone. And it's just habit, isn't it? Greed is like that. It becomes a habit, it becomes fast. You get used to things, you expect things, you want things, and if you're not reflecting, which I imagine most parrots don't do, not particularly mindful or reflective, they haven't heard the Dhamma, they're not aware of the Four Noble Truths, they haven't understood suffering as a noble truth. It just becomes a very quick habit of mind. If there's something there that you want, that you like, you just take it. And if you can take it, you just take it. And you get used to it. And the same with aversion. When things don't go your way, unpleasant experiences happen, you don't get what you want, people don't treat you how you want, and so on. If you've never been practicing mindfulness, reflecting, developing the qualities of a sattvarisa, a wise human being, a well-developed human being, then we just fall into aversion very easily, and it can come up very quickly. And so we have this experience, suddenly we're angry, and we don't know where it came from really. We may be vaguely aware, it's because that person said something, or there's traffic on the road, or there's something has happened. But as an experience arising in our own heart, our own mind, often we're not sharp enough because of a whole lifetime of habits, falling into aversion, anger, irritation without recognizing it. So much of our practice is just learning this basic skill of not letting our greed and our anger spill out into our speech, our actions, and developing skillful ways of behavior, being more mindful in our speech, more reflective, more sensitive to how we speak, how we act, how we interact with other people. And this is to our advantage. This is going to bring us peace of mind, a state of mind that is at ease, a sense of well-being. So it's to our own advantage to learn this. But it takes effort, it takes practice. And the reason we do it is because if we don't practice, we fall back into suffering again. And no one likes suffering. We don't like to have conflicts with other people. We don't like to compete with other people. We don't like ourselves when we speak in ways or act in ways that are selfish or harmful towards others. We don't feel good about it, just as we don't like other people acting that way to ourselves. We don't like other people lying to us because they're trying to exploit us or get some advantage over us. We don't like people cheating on us, stealing from us. We don't like people who physically threaten us. Similarly, other people don't like it when we do those things. The more you reflect on this, the more quite naturally your mind inclines towards mindful behavior, mindful speech, mindful action. And particularly the 5 precepts become much more natural for us. So like when you live in a monastery, generally the 5 precepts become the norm in your behavior. So people who live in monasteries for periods of time, for years, decades even, One of the things they reflect on is that, just keeping the 5 precepts over and over again changes your habits of speech, of action. And the sense of well-being that you gain is such a beautiful reward and such a desirable reward. You never want to fall back or go back towards old ways. If you remember before you lived the monastic training, the monastic life, when you didn't keep the 5 precepts, you weren't very mindful. You don't want to fall back to that because you know what it was like. All the regrets, the unhappiness, self-criticism, or the criticism from other people as well, the fears, suspicions. It's not desirable. But the benefits you see very clearly. The peace, the sense of well-being, of keeping precepts, living in a virtuous way, it becomes more and more attractive over time. And keeping the 5 precepts in the world as a layperson is still possible, it's doable. But it's harder to find people who do it well because there's so many temptations and the society is often not so supportive of it. So you tend to find those people more people who live in monasteries or are just associated with monasteries and Sangha. They're often people who display that level of integrity, that they don't steal, they don't lie, they're not physically violent. They have a quality we call the Hiriotapa, the guardians of the world, the guardian angels of the world, Hiriotapa, a sense of shame, fear of wrongdoing, fear of the consequences of wrongdoing. The more you associate with Sangha, with fellow practitioners, the more you put effort into reflecting on your behavior, your precepts, and the more you shy away from creating dukkha and suffering, the more your Hiriotapa becomes developed. The Buddha compared Hiriotapa is compared to, say you have a stick, an iron rod, say, and on one end you have excrement, another end you have, it's red hot, it's been sitting in a fire and it's red hot. You wouldn't want to grab either end. And this is like the qualities of Hiriotapa, the guardian angels of the mind. No one wants to grab excrement because it smells, it's unpleasant. It's like the sense of shame is like that. You just stay away from extreme behavior of greed, lust, anger, selfishness, because it's just unpleasant, like excrement. And the other end, the red hot end, it hurts if you grab it. It's painful. It's like the fear of the consequences of acting in lustful, greedy, selfish, angry ways. You become much more sensitive to the results of your behavior, and you don't want to create more suffering for yourself or others. So you keep your hand well away from the red hot metal. These 2 qualities develop over time as you practice. Your mind becomes more sensitive to cause and effect, and you get to see the value of being mindful, restrained in your speech and actions. So it's like you have these guardian angels with you. And you just, however much you're provoked or however bad the situation is, however much pain you're experiencing, whether it's physical pain, illness, injury, or something that's come your way from external sources, you just shy away from extremes of greed and anger in your behavior. Because you see the suffering, the pain, the suffering that kind of behavior causes. So this is one of the results of once faith arises and you're practicing, following this path, then you start to shy away from creating further suffering for yourself and others, and you're aware of the consequences of your actions, so you don't want to do things or say things that will cause suffering. That's why people like to meet monks and nuns and monastics, because generally their level of Hiriotapa is high, it's well developed, so they're pleasant to be around. And they may not be perfect, they may still have internal mental defilements arising. Some greed, anger arises here and there. But generally, they're pleasant to be around because you feel you can trust them, and then you get respect coming up. And generally, as a monastic, you never tell a lie. You don't have to tell a lie. That's another thing. You don't have to deceive other people. And so it's quite pleasant living like that. You never have to lie. You never have to fake it. You don't have to produce fake news. You never have to lie. You never have to deceive other people. And that's a real freedom of mind. You feel at ease in yourself. And you know you're not doing something that other people will cause disrespect in other people, or cause other people to be suspicious of you or not trust you. You notice when there's news about something like, say, when there's a war, what happens in a war is people lose their hiriotapa. And the most coarsest kinds of human behavior come out in a war. Like everything can happen. People can treat each other like animals, basically. They can kill, they can steal, they can rape, they can kill children, they can do all kinds of horrible things because those guardian deva qualities have gone. They can lie, so you get lots of propaganda, fake news. That's the nature of war. It's like humans go down to the lowest level. But most of the world is not at war. Most of the world doesn't want to be at war, sees war as an ugly thing and do their best to avoid it. And one reason is because we incline towards the peace of mind, the sense of well-being. When the mind has hiriotapa, has this sense of shame, fear of wrongdoing, is a good place to be. And it means people can live together quite peacefully and happily when you have these qualities. This is why we call them the guardian angels of the world. You can walk down the street when people have a sense of shame, fear of wrongdoing, because you can trust that the average person you meet is not going to hurt you. They're not going to steal from you. They're not going to take advantage of you. Whenever a society gets to a low point, those qualities have gone, then you're living in fear, basically. You don't know who to trust, don't know where to go, and it's unpleasant. And it's difficult to practice the Dhamma in those situations as well. To sit down and meditate, if you're in a place where you can't trust the people around you, is very difficult, because you don't want to close your eyes and meditate because you can't be sure what anyone else is going to do. So this is something to really value, isn't it? When you've heard the Buddhist teachings, you put them into practice, you really start to value qualities like sense of shame, fear of wrongdoing, mindfulness, compassion, patience. And you see the harm when you are impatient, when you lose your compassion, when you're not mindful, when you don't have hiriotapa. You see the harm of that. So your mind quite naturally inclines towards these qualities, and they become like good habits that you develop over time. Our human mind is a conditioned thing. This is what the Buddha pointed out. It's a conditioned thing. So if we're caught into suffering, that's because the conditions, the causes have built up for that suffering to arise. But then coming out of suffering also has its causes and conditions. So if you're noticing greed in your behavior, like the parrots, they don't notice, but we can. If you notice you're acting in a selfish, greedy way, then that's the time to turn to the Dhamma, isn't it? Say, oh, this is wrong, this is causing me suffering, causing others suffering as well maybe. I've got to change this. So you see the suffering of greed or lust or exploitative behavior perhaps, and you stop and you say, this is something to change, give it up. So then you look for the way out, or non-greed, behavior that's rooted in non-greed. So maybe more restraint, more moderation in the way you consume things, the way you earn your living, the way you treat the people around you, bringing up more compassion and sensitivity. So when you see the harm of greed, then you see the value of kindness, compassion, helpfulness. Your non-greed leads on to a lot of being helpful to other people. It's the opposite, isn't it? You bring up the opposite qualities. Again, you see that in a monastery. In a monastery, you learn to help, not just your own group, but everyone. Because in a monastery, it's a place where people come from all directions, all shapes and sizes, all genders, all ages, all backgrounds. And you're no longer acting like you might do in the family. When you live in a family situation, of course, there are many generous people in families as well, but generally you're thinking of yourself and your family, whether you're just one person, two people, a few people. You tend to focus more on your group, earning money, helping them, supporting them. In a monastery, everyone becomes your family, whether you like them or not, whoever they are. And you're developing that much more unconditional compassion, kindness, mindfulness. So your behavior becomes ungreedy. You may still notice greed coming up, of course, but generally you become ungreedy, unselfish in your behavior. So it's another attractive quality when you come to meet with monastics, monks, nuns, people who've been practicing. Again, then not only are they harmless, they're honest, they don't lie, they don't cheat, but also tend to be more unselfish in their behavior. They can be kind to anyone, not just one group of people or one individual. They can be kind to anyone. In monasteries, Buddhist monasteries tend not to be places of politics, say. We support all political parties, but not because of the politics, just because they're people. Male, female, young, old, whatever your political persuasion, or you have no political persuasion. In a monastery, that's the way you treat people. It's a place where you're developing unselfish attitudes, unselfish behavior based on non-greed, non-attachment. When we follow our lust, it tends to be more, I like you, I want you, you're good for me, whether it's in terms of economic lust, because you want things or money from a person, or just lust based on physical attraction, I want you as my partner. Your mind becomes very narrow then, very self-centered, selfish. And we actually get a lot of suffering for that, because we become so attached, so possessive of the object of our lust. When we lose it or we don't get it, we become very frustrated, angry. But in a monastery, monastic living is not based on lust. It's based on letting go, on renunciation, on kindness, compassion. So it's a much more broad, your mind becomes more broader. And the same with aversion. You're not acting from aversion. And anger, anger against one individual, one group of individuals. You're learning to be more forgiving, tolerant of every group. So again, this is why a monastery becomes quite a pleasant place to live in or associate with over the years. So all of this is what we call the causes for the end of suffering, developing the path. The path is rooted in non-greed, non-anger, and non-delusion, which is the hardest one of all, isn't it? Why do we suffer? Well, one reason is because we attach to this body and mind with a sense of self. So if anything goes wrong, we don't get what we want, we suffer. We're not happy. We become disappointed. Sometimes we just turn on ourselves, we're disappointed with ourselves. Sometimes we're blaming others, disappointed with other people, what they've said and done. But it's coming from the delusion of self, that there is this me, and sometimes it's almost, it's tragic, sometimes it's almost comic, isn't it? When people criticize us and the amount of suffering that comes up because of the sense of self. The words of other people can hurt us so much, and we remember them and keep them in our mind maybe for days and weeks and years. And what is it? It's just words. It's just sound that comes to the ear, and then we hold on to it with a sense of self, so we feel hurt. Maybe we get actually physical pain based on the suffering that has arisen based on someone else's words. They have a different view on things than us, different opinions, or they just insult us or whatever. But the pain that comes out is mental pain, but also sometimes physical pain as well. The suffering because of attachment to this sense of self. If we can develop more mindfulness and catch what's going on, we know these are words, sound, come to the ear. There's the feeling, the unpleasant feeling. But if we can be mindful, we see this arises and passes away. It's impermanent. And this is one of the miracles of mindfulness. It gives rise to insight, can support insight in seeing into the impermanent nature of phenomena. Physical phenomena, mental phenomena. So that means hearing, which is consciousness, isn't it? Sound, which is a physical thing. There's the ear, it's a physical thing. There's ear consciousness arises. That's a mental thing. Both physical and mental phenomena, they arise and pass away, and that's what mindfulness reveals. And that's why we have to practice meditation as well to deal with our suffering. We practice virtuous behavior and learning to be more mindful of our speech, our actions, but then we also have to develop mindfulness internally through meditation. And that starts to reveal what's going on. Where does this sense of inner suffering come from? This sense of self that's been hurt. And sometimes it's nothing to do with anyone else either. It's just our own thoughts about ourselves. Maybe we have a high ideal expectation of life and it's not being met, so we start to feel disappointed with ourselves. Feel like a failure, feel disappointed, become depressed. Maybe we didn't achieve some goal. It's all just come from attaching to a certain way of thinking, a habitual way of thinking that comes up over and over again, maybe negative thinking, often directed to ourselves, maybe to our world, how we view the world around us. My world is no good, I failed, I'm no good. And we attach to that and become very unhappy in ourselves, because we don't see the arising and ceasing of our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings. Whereas when we practice mindfulness, that's what starts to become more obvious. We may have a negative thought arise, but it's just a negative thought that arises. It's there for a while, then it passes away, and then it's gone. And if you continue to be mindful, then you're aware that, it's also finished, it ceased, ended just now. And you become more aware of those times when you're not thinking in that negative way. And that helps you to understand that the negative thinking, the feeling, the emotion is not a self. It's a state of mind, true, but it arises, passes away, and we don't have to cling on to it and form an attachment or an identity based around that set of negative thoughts. This is one of the wonders of mindfulness. It helps us to see that and know that better. It actually frees our mind up from suffering, internal suffering. Start to experience a mind that knows how to let go of negative thoughts, worries, fears, self-criticism, disappointment, depression. This is what we learn through meditation. If we don't do this, then we tend to be, a slave of every thought. We believe it, we attach to it. So of course, when things are going well, we become happy, but then things don't always go well, so then we become disappointed, fed up, frustrated, angry. And we're just constantly a slave to every mood, every emotion that comes up. Whereas when we practice more mindfulness, then we can look at things and see them more clearly. It's like the monk who lived with Ajahn Chah, the foreign monk, meditation wasn't going very well. He hadn't quite got this point. He was always seeing things in a negative light because he had so many hopes and ideals about how he wanted his meditation to be, how he wanted his practice as a monk to be, his life to be. He's always comparing his daily experience with these high ideals. You might say, he was a perfectionist, and everything never quite met up to his ideals. Life in the monastery, he always wanted to have the most ideal conditions for his meditation, peace, nice peaceful place in the forest with nothing to bother him, so no insects, which is impossible in the jungle. The temperature has to be just right, which is impossible in Thailand because it's nearly always too hot, or very occasionally it gets too cold. And then the food has to be just right, but it was never just right. The other people have to behave just right, always do what he wanted, and they never did what he wanted. And in the monastery it had to be just the right amount of work and chores, and then just the right amount of free time. And his robes had to be just right, and they were never just right. And he had a list of complaints in his mind always, because he was constantly comparing his ideals of how the world should be, his expectations, and then the reality, and he was always becoming disappointed. So wherever he went, he was complaining and unhappy. Ajahn Chah would send him to different monasteries to see if he could learn how to be more peaceful in these different places. Because he'd go one place and he was unhappy, and then he'd go to another place and he's unhappy, and he'd come back and he'd be complaining, it's not right, it's not good, this is wrong, that is wrong. So in the end, Ajahn Chah said, oh, you're like someone with excrement in your bag. And wherever you go, it's going to smell, isn't it? Because you've still got excrement in your bag, but you haven't realized. So you go from one monastery to another, and it smells in each place you go. This is like someone who hasn't established enough mindfulness to see their own negative thinking and what's bringing it on. The more idealistic we become, the more we attach to our ideas of perfection and how life should be and how we should be, then we're setting ourselves up for this mind that is always disappointed, even angry. So it's like we've always got a little bit of excrement in our bag with us. We never quite get beyond it. It's always smelling. The nature of this world, unfortunately, is its imperfect place. There will always be problems. Other people's problems, world war problems, wars, floods, all kinds of external issues, but then also our own internal problems. We have our own health problems as we get older, and we have our own thoughts and moods and feelings to deal with. But the important thing is to develop the qualities to deal with it, the mindfulness, and then reflect on the changing nature of this process of the mind, and not to identify with it too strongly, and be more accepting of the fact that things that do change and things don't always go according to our desires. If we're always following desire and following our expectations, we're always going to get disappointed. We'll never be happy, never find true peace. This is the hardest lesson we have to learn from suffering, how to be mindful of suffering, its origin. Those negative thoughts, the desires, wanting things to be a certain way, the reactions of aversion, not happy with how things are turning out, and then this automatic identification with it, always taking it as self. This is me. My views, my opinions, my disappointments, my happiness that I can't hold on to. You're getting to see that more clearly through practicing mindfulness. Every time you bring up mindfulness, they say it's a moment of good karma. It's a moment that you can go beyond dukkha, suffering. It's when you start to see suffering as a noble truth. Suffering is just suffering. It's just the way it is. The world is this way. My mind is this way. My body is this way. It's just the way things are. And mindfulness starts to reveal that. It gives you a chance to get beyond suffering. So if you keep practicing, then you have a chance to bring your mind under control, to control the fires of the mind, the fires of greed, anger, delusion. You have a chance to live in more peace. Even if the world is not particularly peaceful, you have a chance to be peaceful when you bring up the qualities of the practice, put effort into that. So I'll leave you with these reflections tonight.